شكرا جزاك الله خير. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا، وأنت يا حي يا قيوم تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا سهلا. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. والتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة رسوله والدعاء إلى الهدى والدلاء إلى الخيرات ابتغاء وجه الله وقرب ثوابه سبحانه وتعالى. Bismillah. So thank everyone for attending this session, and we ask Allah that He fill it with goodness and with benefit. And I just want this to be a reminder that we talk about, this guest that we will be receiving, which is the guest of Ramadan, the great month of Ramadan. And we just take some reminders and some rulings about Ramadan. There's some reminders and some rulings concerning Ramadan. And one of the great Imams, the teacher of Imam Malik, Imam al-Zuhri, he used to say, upon the entrance of Ramadan, he used to say, إنما هو قراءة القرآن وإطعام الطعام. He says that Ramadan is only reading the Quran and feeding people with ta'am, and feeding people with giving people food. This kind of encapsulates the spirit of Ramadan. So Bismillah, so learning fiqh for Ramadan is important because there are different degrees of fasting and there are different degrees of benefiting from Ramadan. And definitely the more knowledge that we have with regards to any action, the stronger our foundation will be and the more fruitful that action will be. So it is important to learn things that pertain to Ramadan, even if they be legal, technical, Sharia rulings. But that is a really important branch of knowledge that pertains to Ramadan. And sometimes there is actually more than meets the eye. Sometimes there's more than meets the eye. Sometimes there's things that we just hear and we don't really have a basis for them, quote unquote, folklore fiqh, where it's just kind of fiqh that's been passed on without any real basis. So it is important just to brush up on a few different important topics. And one of the early tabi'een, Maymun bin Mehran, he said that the easiest part of fasting is leaving food and drink. That's the first degree of fasting. That's the easiest part of fasting. In other words, there's more than that. But again, if we approach fasting from this knowledge base, inshallah, it will enhance our month and our experience of the month of Ramadan. So first and foremost, I want to look a little bit about into the history of Ramadan, because as you know, Ramadan was not an obligation in the Meccan period, but it became an obligation when the Prophet ﷺ, when he migrated to Medina. And there's a wisdom that Allah postponed the obligation of Ramadan, is that Allah wanted that the Iman to be firmly established, so that the Quran was firmly established, Iman was firmly established, Salah was firmly established. And because fasting is not easy, is that Allah wanted it to be when the Muslims are in a strong state. So He postponed the obligation of Ramadan to the Medinan period, and more specifically, the second year after the Hijrah. So the second year after the Hijrah, it was Ramadan, the fast of Ramadan was made obligatory in the month of Sha'ban. In the month of Sha'ban, prior to that, the Prophet ﷺ, in a hadith that Aisha narrates, that he enjoined fasting on the day of Ashura for the first year of Hijrah. So that was the obligation when they first migrated to Medina. But in the second year, when the month of Ramadan came, is that Allah revealed the verses, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, kutiba alaykumus siyamu, kama kutiba ala alladhina min qablikum, la'allakum tattakun, addressing the believers, the faithful. Allah says, fasting is prescribed for you, as it was for those before you, so that perhaps you will attain or you become mindful of Allah, and that is taqwa. And then Allah says fasting is but a prescribed number of days. In other words, the 29 or 30 days of Ramadan. So once Ramadan became an obligation, the fast of Ashura was optional. Those who chose to fast fasted, and those who chose not to fast did not fast. So that's with regard to the history of Ramadan. And then what does the word Ramadan mean? So looking a little bit into the etymology of Ramadan, right? What does the month of Ramadan mean? And actually, there was a name for this month before it was called Ramadan. The original name for this month, in what you can call Proto-Arabic, which was the Arabic of the people of Ad and Thamud, the ancients, the name for Ramadan was Zahir. And then scholars mention that about 200 years before Islam, the Quraysh and the Arabs began to name the months, rename the months. So the prehistoric names, they replaced them with new names, and these are the names that we know now: al-Muharram and Rajab and Sha'ban and Ramadan. So there's about 200 years before Islam, and they mentioned that it was actually the Prophet ﷺ's great grandfather, Kilab bin Mu'ra, who renamed them. When they renamed the months, they renamed them according to the season and according to the season that they were in. So Ramadan coincided with the heat of summer, thus they called it Ramadan, and Ramda means scorching. So because it was the hottest month of the year, they called it Ramadan, and Ramda means scorching hot. And you could take from that a spiritual allusion, is that when somebody fasts the month of Ramadan, is that burns up one's sins and all one's faults and character defects. Is that just like the heat purifies and burns, the month of Ramadan is also a source of purification in that it burns up one's sins. Also, you can say the pain of fasting is like heat that also burns up one's stomach. And related to this word Ramadan, which is Ramadan, is the verb Rama or Rama. So it's the inversion of letters. Ramadan is Ra, Mim, Dad, and then Ra, Ma is to catch on fire, to burn or to blaze. So Ra, Mim, Dad, and then Dad, Ra, Mim, to catch on fire or to burn or to blaze. And also related to the same three letters, interestingly, is Marada, which is sickness. And perhaps the relationship there is that when somebody falls ill, what happens is that they catch a fever, and their fever burns up and it fights that illness. So it's interesting that whichever way that you look at the three letters, it carries that meaning of heat, and it carries that meaning of burning up. So, and then with regards to the purpose of Ramadan, or what the lessons of Ramadan are, that's a very detailed discussion. It's a very beneficial discussion, and it's important for us to remember, right, why we observe Ramadan. Right, it's always important to connect to the spirit of Ramadan. And the scholars, they say that Ramadan is a madrasa, is that Ramadan is like an institute that has so many lessons that you can learn from. There's so much that one can take from Ramadan. And it's as if every generation or every Ramadan, there's something new to learn. So there's always something to take from Ramadan. But some of the most important learning lessons from Ramadan is that, as Allah says, that Allah has made fasting obligatory, and then Allah gives the reason right there at the end of that verse, where He says, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, such that you may attain, in hopes that you actualize, you develop your taqwa, And taqwa is often translated as God, mindfulness or consciousness or fear of Allah. But taqwa is actually, it's a very deep and profound word, and it's very comprehensive. So let's just look a little bit of what taqwa means linguistically, and then from the linguistic meaning of taqwa, we should understand what the concept or what the idea is that taqwa literally means to shield oneself from something that they fear, to put a barrier between yourself and that thing that you fear. And that's why wiqaya is some type of prevention. Some type of prevention is wiqaya. So for example, the Arabs would say, ittaqa al-matar, is that the rain was coming down and that that person, he fled or he opened his umbrella or he got out of the way of the rain. He didn't want to get soaked. So he distanced himself. He shielded himself from getting soaked from the rain. So that's and that's why the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Ittaqu an-nar walau bi shiqqi tamra," is that have taqwa of the fire, even if it be by half a date. And the scholars, they say, what does that mean? Is that make this wiqaya, make this shield between yourself and the fire, even if it be giving charity of a very small portion amount, is that will be a source of protection for you from the fire. So that's ittaqu fire, taqwa of the fire, by doing good deeds that will distance you from that the Jahannam. So from a Sharia perspective, taqwa is shielding oneself from that which is sinful by abstaining and avoiding prohibitions. By abstaining and avoiding prohibitions. And Ramadan is here to strengthen or to develop this taqwa ability or this taqwa muscle or this taqwa technique, because in Ramadan, right, we give up things that are otherwise permissible. Right? So if someone can give up eating and drinking and other activities in Ramadan, then how can it not be the case that they can't give up things that are prohibited outside of Ramadan? So we train ourselves to develop this taqwa by abstaining things that are even permissible, such that it will be easy or easier to abstain from things that are impermissible. So this is one of the most important lessons of Ramadan, is that it's there to strengthen our taqwa. So when we approach Ramadan, we should always be thinking, right, how can I use this Ramadan to develop my taqwa, right? To develop my taqwa and to navigate, right, life in a way that is informed by your God consciousness, your taqwa. And one of the Sahaba, they were asked, what is taqwa? Right, they said, what is taqwa? And he gave a very succinct and a very beautiful imagery. He said that, have you ever passed by a path that had a lot of thorns on the ground, right? Or there was broken glass, or there was something that was dangerous to step on? And the person said, of course. He said, what did you do? He said that, I walked very carefully. I made sure that I didn't step on anything. I watched my step. So he said, that is taqwa. Right? He said that is taqwa. So the idea there is that in life, there are different things that we have to navigate that are harmful. But if we navigate carefully, is that is employing this taqwa ability. So Ramadan, again, is there to develop this taqwa. And that is one of the most important goals of Ramadan. Another important lesson of Ramadan is that it teaches us patience. It teaches us patience and perseverance. And patience is self-restraint and control. If someone's able to control themselves and to be self-disciplined, that is patience. And there's three types of patience. There's patience of avoiding sins, right? So somebody might want to do something that's prohibited, but they're able to check themselves. And then there's patience with regards to being consistent, right? So you might not want to wake up before Fajr or for Fajr, but you're able to persevere and to wake up despite yourself, is that that is a great type of patience. And then there's patience with regards to calamities, when something happens that is not something that we want and we deem as bad. It takes patience to withhold ourselves from reacting in a way that isn't pleasing to Allah, in a way that isn't good. And that takes self-control. So Ramadan is all about patience. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said that Siyam is half of sabr. He said that fasting equates half of patience, sabr. And he said that Ramadan is the month of patience, and the reward for patience is nothing less than paradise. So again, we should think of Ramadan not just of 30 days, but something that really equalizes the rest of the year, something that we could take from Ramadan and that could enhance the year to come, and inshallah could enhance our lives and our lifestyles from that one Ramadan. But that depends on the amount, how meaningful that we make Ramadan, how much of these lessons and benefits do we take from the blessed month of Ramadan. So it's important to remind ourselves that this is really the spirit, and this is really what's sought in Ramadan. And fasting and Taraweeh and the other acts of ibadah are there to foster and to nourish these qualities and these lessons. Another lesson is gratitude. Gratitude is that recognizing and acknowledging, right, all of the blessings that we have. And oftentimes we're unaware of these blessings, but when we lose them, even if temporarily, we start to realize how valuable they are. And Allah says with regards to gratitude and Ramadan, He says, وَلِتُكْمِلُوا الْعِدَّةَ, is that you should complete the amount of time, the month of Ramadan. وَلِتُكَبِّرُوا اللَّهَ عَلَى مَا هَدَاكُمْ, and that you declare Allah's greatness, saying Allahu Akbar for His guidance. And that is the sunnah of Yawm al-Eid, that we say Allahu Akbar, that is taken directly from this verse. وَلَعَلَّكُمْ تَشْكُرُونَ, and again, in the hopes that you develop, right? لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَشْكُرُونَ, in the hopes that you learn this lesson, in the hopes that you are now a lot more grateful than you were before Ramadan. Right? So Allah expresses لَعَلَّكُمْ, in the hopes that, right? So some people will get it, and some people will get it to different degrees and different portions, but Allah is putting it out there. And it's up to us to take our portion, and that comes by responding and receiving it in the best of manners. So the more prepared we are for Ramadan, the more likely we'll be able to draw from this blessed month of Ramadan. Another important lesson from Ramadan is it helps to refine one's character, to polish one's character. And there's a direct link between fasting and having good character. And the Prophet ﷺ said that fasting is a shield. So when one of you fasts, he may not be obscene or rough. In other words, if you're fasting and you don't have, it's not reflecting in your character, then you're not exactly doing it right. Something's missing. You're not learning something that you're supposed to be learning. And then we all know the hadith, if someone insults him or wants to fight him or her, then the fasting person should say, all right, I don't do this, I am fasting. Another hadith, when one of you wakes up in the morning for fasting, then he should not use obscene language or behave foolishly. If anyone abuses him or fights him, he should say twice, indeed I am fasting, to that person, indeed I am fasting. And we know that ما من شيء أثقل في ميزان المؤمن يوم القيامة من خلق حسن, and that nothing is heavier in the scales of the believer on the day of judgment than good character. So again, Ramadan is there to teach us and to instill within us this beautiful quality of good character. Two more purposes of Ramadan. Again, this is a reminder and fiqh, so we'll cover both. But is that Ramadan helps us to conquer our enemies. It helps us to conquer our enemies. And who are our enemies? For the devil, desires, distractions, and dunya. For these, the devil desires, distractions, and dunya. And your ego, your desires, when someone's fasting and abstaining from food and drink, it weakens the ego. And shaitan manipulates people by using their desires and distractions and the dunya. So shaitan uses your desires to distract you, to get you into the dunya, and then once you're in the dunya, you'll be distracted. So fasting curtails all of that. And there's a hadith that says, لولا أن الشياطين يحومون على قلوب بني آدم لنظروا إلى ملكوت السماوات. Is that the Prophet said that? Were it not the fact that people have shaitanic influences, that shaitan revolves or has influences on the heart of people, if it were not for that, is that they would see the heavenly kingdom with their own eyes. In other words, they would have this kashf or this unveiling, is that they would see the realities of this deen, the spiritualities, with their own eyes, but we're veiled from that often because of these enemies. And Ramadan is there that we can also subdue our enemies. And as you know, shaitan is locked up in Ramadan. Right? So that's an example of how Ramadan is there to teach us and to instill in us this lesson. And then lastly, Ramadan is also has benefits of health. There's also health benefits of Ramadan. And there's a hadith that says very explicitly, the Prophet said that it's not the intention that we make, but this is one of the benefits that we take from Ramadan. The Prophet said, Sumu tasihhu, is that fast and you will be in good health. Literally, Sumu tasihhu, fast and you will be in good health. And now we know there's a lot of studies that prove the benefits of intermittent fasting and how it improves the immune system and how it improves insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance. And there's a whole slew of benefits that comes with fasting. And Allah has made this healthy act of fasting. He has embedded it within the deen itself. So this is also something that we could take advantage of, as long as we're also eating healthily and we're not eating the wrong foods when we break our fast and for suhoor, but we could take advantage. So those are some of the purposes of Ramadan. And again, it's open to reflection. And there might be lessons that come to your heart that has not come to the heart of anybody else, or there might be lessons that are specific to you. But if we reflect upon the benefits of Ramadan, we'll continue to extract and learn and to benefit from Ramadan. And that's why they describe Ramadan as being Ramadan is Kareem. Ramadan is generous, is that it gives and it gives and it gives and it never stops giving. But the condition there is there has to be receivers. So if there's people that are eligible for the gifts of Ramadan, is that they'll never get their full. Ramadan will keep on giving and keep on giving and keep on giving, because Ramadan is Kareem, and that Allah is manifesting His generosity through Ramadan. So we see the generosity of Allah through Ramadan. If you want to see how Allah gives gifts, look at what is given in Ramadan and you'll understand something about the generosity and the mercy of Allah, because Ramadan is a reflection of Allah's attribute of Him being Kareem. And that's why Ramadan is Kareem. And the Prophet ﷺ, he was described as being the most generous person, especially in the month of Ramadan. He'd be even more generous. So Allah is generous, right? The Prophet ﷺ is generous, and Ramadan is generous. Therefore, we should also be generous in Ramadan, and to make that one of our practices, to be more generous, not just with our wealth, but with our soul and with our time and with everything that we have, giving Ramadan everything that we have. And if you look at the way that the scholars treated Ramadan, is that once Ramadan entered, they had no distractions as much as possible, but they would just be solely dedicated to whatever, to the different functions and different actions of Ramadan. Let's mention that Imam Malik, the great Imam Malik, he said that he would fajru in Ramadan, he would flee from teaching hadith and teaching other subjects, and he would just solely read the Quran day in and day night, day in and night in Ramadan. No. So with that, there are many virtues of Ramadan. I think We could take some, and many of these we've heard before, but it's there to inspire us and to make us desirous of what Ramadan has to offer. And this is really the spirit of Ramadan. And this is really the spirit of Ramadan. The Prophet said, "Man sama Ramadan iman wa ihtisaban, ghufira lahu ma taqaddama min dhanbihi." As whoever fasts Ramadan out of faith and in hope of receiving from Allah, is that whatever proceeded from his sins will be forgiven. And when man qama Ramadan, ghufira lahu ma taqaddama min dhanbihi, and that whoever stands during Ramadan in Tarawih at night, is that again their sins will be forgiven. وَمَنْ قَامَ لَيْلَةُ الْقَدْرِ غُفِرَ لَهُ مَا تَقَدَّمَ مِنْ ذَنْبِهِ. And whoever stands on Laylatul Qadr, is that whatever sins preceded him in his life, he'll be forgiven of them. So what about someone that fasts Ramadan, right? Stands in the nights of Ramadan and reaches Laylatul Qadr, all three, right? That's something that we should, right? It's food for thought. The Prophet said, إِذَا كَانَ أَوَّلَ لَيْلَ مِنْ شَهْرِ رَمَضَانَ فُتِحَ أَبْوَابُ الْجِنَانِ. Is that when the first night of Ramadan enters, the doors of paradise are open. فَلَمْ يُغْلَقْ مِنْهَا بَابٌ وَاحِدٌ شَهْرَ كُلُّهُ. And that not a single door is closed throughout the whole month. وَغُلِقَتْ أَبْوَابُ النَّارِ فَلَمْ يُفْتَحْ مِنْهَا بَابٌ شَهْرَ كُلُّهُ. And that the doors of Jahannam are shut, and not a single door of Jahannam is opened during Ramadan. وغلت رتات الجن ونادي مناد من السماء كل الليل إلى انفجار الصبح. And that the rebellious jinn, the shayateen, are locked up, and a caller calls from the heavens every night until Fajr time. Ya baghi al-khair yammim wa abshir. O seeker of good, come forward and rejoice. Ya baghi al-shar aqsir wa absir. O seeker of evil, evildoer, is that stop, refrain, and open your eyes. هل من مستغفر يغفر له. Is there anyone seeking forgiveness such that I forgive him? هل من تائب يتاب عليه. Is there anyone seeking repentance such that I turn towards him and relent towards him? هل من داع استجاب له. Is there any caller that I should answer him? هل من سائل أعطى سؤاله. Is anybody asking such that I give him such that I answer his call? والله عز وجل عند كل فطر من شهر رمضان كل ليل ارتقى من النار 60,000. And that Allah has at the time of break fast every evening, every eve, people that He frees from the fire. And it's mentioned in this hadith, 60,000. Is that 60,000 people every evening of Ramadan are saved from the fire. فإذا كان يوم الفطر أعتق الله مثل ما أعتق في جميع الشهر. And that when it comes to Eid al-Fitr, Allah releases from the fire the amount that He released the whole month, the whole 30 days, and that is marratan at once, 60,000, so 60,000 times 30. And that is a hadith that is in Bayhaqi. And one last hadith about the virtues of Ramadan. أعطيت الأمة خمس خصال في رمضان لم تعطى لغيرهم. Is that this ummah was given 5 qualities or 5 things in Ramadan that weren't given to anybody else. So these are specific to you and I, to people of the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ. What are these 5 things? أعطيت أمتي في شهر رمضان خمسا نعم أما واحدة فإنه إذا كان أول الليل من شهر رمضان نظر الله عز وجل إليهم. The first is that when it's the first night of Ramadan, Allah glances towards His slaves. Allah glances towards the ummah. وَمَنْ نَظَرَ إِلَيْهِ لَمْ يُعَذِّبْهُ أَبَدًا. And that whoever Allah glances towards with this glance of mercy, He never ever punishes him after that. One, so that's the glance of Allah. We should make an effort to expose ourselves to the glance of Allah on the first night of Ramadan. Number 2, فِإِنَّ خُلُوفَ أَفْهَامِهِمْ أَفْوَاهِهِمْ حِينَ يَمُسُّونَ أَطْيَبْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ مِنْ رِيحِ الْمِسْكِ. Is that we know this hadith that the scent, their breath when they're fasting is more pleasant to Allah than the scent of misk, of musk. Number 3, فَإِنَّ الْمَلَائِكَةُ تَسْتَغْفِرُ لَهُمْ فِي كُلِّ يَوْمٍ وَلَيْلَةٍ. The angels seek forgiveness for them every day and every night. 4, إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ يَأْمُرُ جَنَّةُ فَيَقُولُ لَهَا اسْتَعِدِّي وَتَزَيِّنِي لِعِبَادِي. And that Allah addresses paradise and says that prepare yourself and adorn yourself for my servants. And then number 5, when it comes to Akhir Layla, when it comes to the last night of Ramadan, غَفَرَ اللَّهُ لَهُمْ جَمِيعًا. Is that Allah forgives every single one of them on that last night of Ramadan. قال رجل من القوم, somebody said, who was hearing this directly from the Prophet, هي ليلة القدر? Is this, you're talking about ليلة القدر? قال لا. He says, this is not ليلة القدر. This is beyond ليلة القدر. قال لا ألم ترى إلى العمال يعملون فإذا فرغوا من أعمالهم وفر أجورهم. He says that, don't you see people that work, laborers, that when they're done their work, that they get their reward? So he said that this is the reward of fasting, is that Allah forgives each and every person from their sins on the last night of Ramadan. So that leads us to our intentions. We should make the intention to gain the gaze of Allah, especially on the first night of Ramadan. We should make the intention to attain the highest portion of His forgiveness, His mercy, and salvation from the fire. We should make the intention to emulate the Prophet ﷺ in his Ramadan, and we should make whatever intentions comes to our heart, because as Imam Junaid said, whoever opens for himself one door of good intentions, whoever makes opens for themselves one bab, one door of good intentions, Allah opens for him 70 doors of ability. So Allah will make 70 things. He'll open 70 doors for you just by opening up that one intention for yourself. So that is, I guess you can say, the reminder part of Ramadan. And now let's look a little bit into the fiqh of Ramadan. So first and foremost, Ramadan starts when the moon is sighted at the end of, when Sha'ban is over, and the moon of Ramadan of the new month is sighted. Or when 30 days is not sighted and Sha'ban is a complete 30 days, then we know for certain that the day after that is Ramadan. And in terms of sighting the moon, is that if the skies are clear, there's no clouds, there's no overcast, then it only takes one upright person to establish is sufficient, one upright person is sufficient in establishing that Ramadan has entered. So if somebody sees it and they're upright person, they're Muslim and they're known for their uprightness, they're not a liar or something like that, then their testimony is accepted and Ramadan becomes binding on everybody. But if it's not clear, if those overcast or clouds, then it requires a large body of people that must all sight the moon. Because of course, if it's not clear, it's very possible that that one person was mistaken, whereas it's not very probable that that large body of people are mistaken. And in the Hanafi madhab, calculations cannot be used to confirm the beginning of Ramadan. So you can't look at the calculations and say that Ramadan the moon is possible to be seen, therefore Ramadan starts. That's not, in the Hanafi madhab, that's not valid. Rather, if the moon is possible to be seen, is that it has to be seen. It has to be seen with one's naked eye. However, calculations can be used for negating the possibility of sighting the moon. So let's say you look at, what the organizations that tell you about the moon cycles, and they say that in this locality, there's a 99% chance it's impossible, it's virtually impossible to sight the moon, right? And then you hear a report from that same locality that someone sighted the moon, that's impossible. So in that case, their testimony won't be accepted, and the calculations of impossibility will overrule their testimony. Or like a country, it might be, that a whole country might be that they everyone knows that it's impossible to sight the moon in that country, in that location. And if that's the case, and they don't, despite the impossibility, they still declare Ramadan, is that we don't follow that. We follow sightings that are confirmed and are not within the realm of impossibility. And it's sunnah that when the Prophet ﷺ when he sighted the moon, he would make this very beautiful dua and say, Allahumma ahilluhu alayna bil yumni wal iman. Oh Allah, let it reside upon us with goodness and good luck and iman. So yumni is fortune, and iman. And they're very closely related linguistically. And was salama wal Islam, and with security and with increase, or with Islam. And then he would address the moon, the crescent directly, and he would say, Rabbi wa Rabbuka, my Lord and your Lord, addressing the crescent. So this is a sunnah of witnessing the moon. And it's a very important sunnah that people go out and find a location that is suitable, that they expect to see the crescent. And it's something that is really beautiful, that when somebody actually witnesses the crescent, they start Ramadan with certainty. They're witnessing the birth of Ramadan with their own eyes, and I guarantee you their experience of Ramadan or Eid will be completely different when they see Ramadan, they see the crescent with their own eyes. So it's a good thing for people, whether individually or collectively, to go out and to look for the moon, where the crescent, where it's expected. So that's with regards to the beginning of Ramadan, and with regards to the definition of fasting. The definition of fasting is that, very simply, it's withholding, to withhold from eating, drinking, sexual intercourse during daylight hours with an intention of fasting performed by someone capable and someone required to do so. So there's a lot to unpack in that definition. Each part of that definition has different rulings that pertain to it. So we'll slowly unpack this definition. So what is the ruling of fasting? Fasting? Well, there's actually 7 types of fasts. So there's fasting that is fard, there's fasting that is wajib, there's fasting that is sunnah, there's fasting that is mustahab, there's fasting that is disliked, and then there's fasting that is makruh tahriman, which means that it's haram. So for example, fasting on the days of Eid is actually impermissible, it's actually sinful. With regards to the fasting of Ramadan, that is of course one of the greatest obligations of Islam. It's one of the 5 pillars of Islam, so it is definitely obligatory and required upon every responsible Muslim, both in its time and as makeup. So if someone didn't fast that Ramadan, it's still an obligation. Even if Ramadan passed, they have to make up their fasts if certain conditions are met. If they meet these conditions, then it's an obligation. So what are the conditions that must be met for Ramadan to be an obligation? Very simply put, is that the person has to be Muslim. They have to possess sound sanity, right? Their mental faculties have to be sound. They can't be insane, and they have to be at the age of puberty and beyond. So children and people who have who have insanity, who are not Muslim, it's not an obligation for them to fast. Likewise, 3 more things is that well, there's a little bit details about these 3, but they have to be resident. So someone who's traveling, there's a discussion, but it's not obligatory for them to fast. They have to be healthy. So someone who's sick, it's not obligatory for them to fast. And they have to be free of the menstruational cycle. So someone who is undergoing the menstruational cycle, it's not obligatory for them to fast. We'll talk about these 3 in more detail next week, inshallah. Next week, we'll talk about those who are exempted. We'll get more into the fiqh. We'll talk about those who are exempted from fasting. We'll talk about the components, the integrals of fasting. We'll talk about what invalidates the fast and requires a kafara, right, expiation. And we'll talk about what invalidates the fast, what breaks the fast, but it doesn't require the kafara. We'll talk a little bit about what is the kafara, what does it mean to expiate one's fast, and then we'll go into more details about suhoor and about breaking the fast and different sunnahs and different miscellaneous matters that pertain to fasting. So inshallah, with that, we could stop if there's any questions, or if there's any comments, or if there's anything that anybody wants to share. Please feel free. We'll go up to 8:30.
Shaykh Hassan.
Yeah, go.
If anyone has any questions or comments.
Yeah, we didn't really get into the fiqh, so there might not be too many questions because we just kind of got to the early portions of the fiqh, but we will, inshallah, get into more detailed fiqh next week, inshallah. So, we have a question here. I feel like I'm doing sorry. Suhoor, you're wrong. Sleep.
Assalamu alaikum. May I ask a question?
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
First, Jazakallah khair, Hassan, thank you much, Shaykh Hassan, for giving us this inspirational lecture. It's very kind of you to do that, and for us Canadian Muslims, it's very, very beneficial knowledge that we've gotten. I just had one question to ask. I have a son who's like maybe 11 or 12 years old, and he, like he's really small, thin, and underweight. And people are telling me that he should be fasting, because other kids at his age are fasting, although they may not be as healthy. They're probably more healthy than he is. But I just want to ask, what is the ruling about that? Like he's at the age where he can understand. He's not quite yet hit puberty yet. So what is your understanding about that? Should kids be required to fast at that age, or how would you negotiate that situation?
Yeah, good question. So kids should be encouraged from around the age of 10. They should be encouraged, and they could do it. Differs from person to person, family to family. Some kids, they just out of their own desire, they just fast all day. Some of them do like a half fast, some of them do every other day, right? So whatever, like training. So before they reach the age of puberty, there should be some type of training to develop the habit and to get used to fasting. But once they become baligh, they reach their pubescent, then it becomes an obligation for them to fast. So unless their health issues are such that they prevent the person from fasting, then they're exempt. But if it's not to that degree, then it's obligatory. It's an obligation for them to fast. And it might not be easy initially, but I think if that training is there, it will make it a lot easier. And then another thing that's important is I think if somebody eats suhoor properly and iftar properly, it should be fine. So for example, for suhoor, making sure that you're eating very nutritional food, maybe high in fats, because that with energy, with healthy fats. So with that, I think inshallah, your son will be able to do it.
Okay, so it's basically it's a discretionary. We can do trial and error for these few years before he hits
until he hits puberty. Correct. Once he hits puberty, then so there should be training before that. But once he hits puberty, then it's an obligation, individual obligation upon him.
I see. Shukran. Thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate that certainty of knowledge. Appreciate it.
No problem. I'll get back to the first question, but the second question I'll just answer quickly. So it's not. So you don't have to make up your missed fasts before the next Ramadan. So you make up you should, it's good. I mean, it's good because you never know, what can happen. But as the obligation to make up your missed fasts is any time. They don't have to be made up before Ramadan, although it's preferable. But it's not an obligation to make them up before next year. So you have, until they're made up to make up your missed Ramadans. Okay, good. And then the first question about suhoor, messes with sleep. I find it. They get really aroused, indulge. I'm not sure. What do you mean by indulge? I heard to work into Ramadan. I think in general, it's not easy. Right? I think in general, it's not easy. But I think going back to Brother Arif's question, I think maybe revisiting what's eaten for suhoor and what's eaten for fitr. So I think if people are eating nutritional meals, it might go a long way in helping with the fast. And I'm not too sure about the second part of that question, asking for a convert they find that they get really aroused. I'm not too sure about that part. But we will talk more about suhoor, inshallah, in the next lesson. So we'll cover things that pertain to suhoor. But suhoor, the Prophet said that in suhoor, there's barakah. There's blessing in suhoor. So it is an important, it's sunnah, it's not obligatory, but it is an important sunnah of fasting and of Ramadan. Any other questions?
We got 2 more minutes if anyone else has any more questions.
No.
So who are you going to go into it next class?
Yeah, we'll talk about different. There's a very important point to make about suhoor and also about breaking the fast. There's a misconception about suhoor, and there's something with regards to breaking the fast that needs to be mentioned. So next class, inshallah.
So you mentioned how at Eid we say Allahu Akbar, and that Ramadan teaches you gratitude for the guidance.
Right.
So is it through like excessive worship and standing in prayer that we get to learn gratitude that way? I don't see the connection between the ayah that you mentioned and how that is related to gratitude or guidance.
Right. So the Prophet, there's a hadith, but the Prophet said that the one who's fasting, they have 2 joys. Farhatan, they have 2 joys. And he said the first joy, what are the 2 joys? The first joy is that one joy is in the dunya, and the next joy is in the akhirah. The joy of the akhirah is that someone sees their fast. The joy of the dunya is not that you're eating delicious food, right, and that you have a nice cold drink of water, but it's that Allah gave you tawfiq to perform such a great act of worship. So again, it comes with reflection, right? But you have to think about, in Ramadan, everything's paused. A lot of things are paused, and it's a time to reflect and to think about the blessings that you have. So even just on a simple level, right, the blessings of the food that you eat, what it feels like to be hungry, and how many people out there, not somewhere in Africa, but on the streets of Toronto, how many people out there are kids, people that are hungry on a daily basis. It's not a nice feeling. It's just temporary. So one, being grateful for food, right? 2, being grateful for your community, being grateful for sharing. You have people that you're in contact with, being grateful for your family, being grateful for people that you break bread with, right? Your companions. And companion in English literally means means with, and pani is bread. So your companions are the people that you break bread with. Right, and being grateful for this great, like you said, for this great worship, for this great ibadah, that you're Muslim, like that you have Ramadan, that you have like guidance, and that you have direction, that you have iman, that you know Allah, that you know the Messenger of Allah, that you know the Sunnah. So just to be grateful for the fact that we have Ramadan, and that's a huge paradigm shift. It's not like a burden. Like, we should be happy to fast. We should welcome Ramadan as a blessing, like a guest, and not just be like, oh no, here comes the 30 days of not eating and drinking. So it's a huge shift of perspective that like we welcome Ramadan. That was kind of what I was trying to convey in this session. Well, Ramadan is a great blessing and gift.
I think there's one more question I was writing down. There's any good books on fasting in English?
I'll get back to that one. Nothing comes. I'll get back to that one. Any books to read before Ramadan? I'll get back to that one as well. Maybe we can make a little book list or something. Okay. So with that, I can excuse myself.
Jazakallah.
Okay.
May Allah bless you.
Likewise.
Inshallah for us. And
Allah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sallam. We ask Allah that He bless us in this month of Sha'ban, and that He forgive us before we enter Ramadan, and that He enable us to have the greatest portion of Ramadan, and that we draw from the great wells and springs of Ramadan that nourish and quench our souls and our thirst, and that He make this one of the most blessed Ramadans for us, and that He enable us to make the most of every moment in this Ramadan, and that we see the fruits of this Ramadan, not just in Ramadan, but after Ramadan and throughout our lives and in our graves and when we meet Allah Most High Ta'ala. So we ask Allah that He accept from us with a complete acceptance, and He bless us with complete blessings. Wa akhir da'wana and alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.
Jazakallah khair.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.